Ons gesels vanoggend met Kavisha Pillay van die organisasie Corruption Watch en ons praat spesifiek oor die Corruption Perception Index en wat dit natuurlik vir Suid-Afrika beteken. Good morning, Kavisha.
Hi, yes, good morning.
Good morning. Now we can hear you. Kavisha, you work for Corruption Watch. So let's just start there. Who is Corruption Watch?
Corruption Watch is a non-profit civil society organization. We were launched 10 years ago, and the work of our organization is to encourage people to report instances or incidents of corruption to us. So over the last 10 years, we've received over 35,000 complaints from people across the country about their experiences of corruption. And what we do with these complaints is that we analyze them, we identify trends and patterns and hotspots of corruption that take place across the country in both the public and private sector. We mount public mobilization campaigns to train people about their rights in relation to corruption, because sometimes you find that people aren't aware that a service is meant to be free and they're not actually meant to be paying for a particular service. We do research, litigation, and a select few investigations on the complaints that we receive.
Well, that's something we all need. And now tell us about this Corruption Perception Index. What does it measure and how, where does the data come from?
So the Corruption Perceptions Index is quite a sort of long-standing instrument. If I'm not mistaken, it was launched in 1995. And basically what happens is that there's 13 institutions across the country, including the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and The Economist, who complete surveys based on their perceptions of a country. That then gets collated and calculated into a single number, which forms an index. So how the index works is that you get rated between 0 to 100. Anything that is under 50 a country would be perceived to be severely corrupt. So for South Africa, for as long as they've been doing the survey, South Africa has never been able to breach that 15 mark. And for the last 10 years that Corruption Watch has been monitoring the survey and has been engaging with its results, we've always been in the region of 42 to 46, 47. So indicating that there are serious corruption problems in the country. What I do want to say, though, is that a perception survey is a perception, so it's not necessarily reality. So a perception may be different to the actual experiences of corruption in the country, but that this survey or this index doesn't actually measure levels of corruption. So these are just perceptions from these institutions about a country's levels of corruption. It focuses on the private sector. Focuses on the public sector, but does not look at corruption within the private sector. And this has been one of the criticisms that's emerged, because we know that in every situation you have a corruptor and a corruptee. And there are some limitations in terms of this particular study. So what we always advise people to do is to not just look at the Corruption Perceptions Index in isolation. You need to look at other perception indexes that exist that measure public perceptions as well, but you also need to look at actual experiences of corruption. So how many reports are sort of the organizations like Corruption Watch or the Public Protector or the Presidential Hotline receiving in terms of exposing corruption, and then measuring that and sobering that up with an actual response to corruption. So one of the surprising things about last year's index was that South Africa actually slipped down a point. And that was surprising to us for a particular reason, in terms of we have seen some significant interventions to respond to corruption in the country. They may not be enough, and I know that the public is not particularly satisfied with that, but I don't think we can discount it entirely. So to see us slip down one point in the scale was quite surprising, and it brought back a sort of memory of a few years ago at the height of state capture, when we actually improved by 2 points that year. So again, it's just a perception. It has to be looked in conjunction with other issues, with other surveys and with other real life experiences and interventions currently taking place.
Kavisha, if we compare South Africa to other countries, how many countries around the world do not actually get to that 50 mark, are seen as corrupt?
So there's two-thirds of the country, two-thirds of the world actually don't breach the 50 mark.
Sure.
The average in terms of the sort of perceptions index is 43, which is exactly where South Africa is sitting right now. So there is two-thirds of the world, according to this survey, can be perceived as having serious corruption issues. And that's not completely unsurprising because we know that there's no country that's been able to deal with this issue in its entirety. There's some experts who say that trying to advocate for a corruption-free society is actually a little bit of a fairy tale because of human nature, because of human values, because we would always show loyalty to particular people, to our family members, to a political party. Corruption is sort of going to always be there. That's not a great thought. It's not a great sort of notion to work with because one doesn't want to live in a society where corruption becomes a culture and it's endemic and you'll never get rid of it. But I do think the survey, what it does highlight is just the nature of corruption all over the world, that there's no country that actually has been able to deal with this decisively. Even the countries that score the best, those are your Scandinavian countries like your Denmark, Sweden, and so on. They are still incidences of corruption. But I think what's different in terms of the highest scoring countries in comparison to the lowest scoring countries are their high levels of accountability. So you can commit corruption, but chances are you're going to be held accountable for that and that you're not going to get away with the crime.
It's good to hear that accountability is key. But we all know the culture of corruption leads to less security, insecurity, safety in the country. It leads to conflict eventually in most parts of the world. In South Africa, you refer to the fact that we have the presidential hotline, the Zondo Commission and its findings, the anti-corruption program, National Corruption Safety Program. Are those things being implemented to an extent that you can say, all right, we see it's working and there is accountability there?
I don't think we're at the point where we're seeing accountability across the board. I think that there's early signs where interventions are being put in place, where law enforcement institutions in particular, so if you look at the Special Investigating Unit, the Independent Directorate, the Hawks, and the NPA, you are seeing some movement in terms of tackling corruption. You're seeing people being prosecuted for corruption, and for a very long while during the period of state capture, that wasn't the case. Unfortunately, they're dealing with the issues around state capture, and then there was the COVID-19 pandemic, and there was a lot of looting that took place there, and then there's these organized crime syndicates that are currently happening now in real time. So one can have a bit of empathy for these law enforcement institutions and what they have to deal with. But I do think in terms of building public confidence in relation to the state's response, law enforcement needs to be capacitated with the right people, with enough resources in order to deal with the complex corruption problem that South Africa is seeing. From my particular sort of standpoint, and that's because I do have a bit of privilege in terms of engaging with various sectors and their response to corruption, you are seeing a greater collaboration between different sectors. So, for example, the government is more willing to work with academia and civil society organizations and even the private sector to deal with these issues. For a long time, that was not heard of. You didn't get a seat at the table. So there's these interventions for a collective whole of society approach to deal with this issue. And I think in that regard, we are seeing some shifts. But because the problem itself is so entrenched in our society and it's so complex and it's ever evolving, it's becoming really important that we're not just sitting and debating about it, that there's actual work getting done and that perpetrators are being brought to book.
Wow, Kavisha, thank you so much for speaking to us about that corruption perception index and creating awareness around it, and also I think just placing a bit of, spotlight on the fact that it takes a collective effort and accountability is key. And I think once again we also then think of whistleblowers and the importance of whistleblowers and they're coming forward to actually assist with corruption. Kavisha, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning.
Thank you.
Dit is natuurlik Kavisha Pillay van die organisasie Corruption Watch wat vanoggend met ons gesels het.